Hi, I'm CB32. This is a video to supplement the lecture about brain anatomy. All the information here can be found in the lecture notes and slides. So today I'm going to be labeling the different parts of the brain and talking about the functions some more. Let's go ahead and start with a structure that isn't actually in the brain but is still part of the central nervous system, and this is the spinal cord. So you can see it at the bottom of our drawing here, the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is where neurons that are bringing in sensory information or sending information to the muscles, all of those nerves are found in the spinal cord. So from the spinal cord, we can make our way upwards into the brain, and in fact into the brainstem. So the first part of the brainstem is called the medulla oblongata. Okay, so the medulla oblongata is a really important part of the brain. You can't survive without it. It's helping to control very basic processes like regulating the blood pressure, controlling your respiratory rate, so how much you're breathing, your heart rate, all these kind of automatic functions. And in fact, we'll talk more about the medulla when we go over the autonomic nervous system. So above the medulla is the pons. It's this part that is sticking out here. Okay, so also part of the brainstem. Pons is also important for these very basic processes like breathing, swallowing, heart rate, blood pressure, all of that. It's also important for sleep, so it's helping to control sleep. And then above that is the midbrain, also part of the brainstem. Okay, so the midbrain is important for doing automatic movements that are being controlled by sensory information. So it's kind of integrating sensory and motor information to help you orient your head and your body towards a stimulus, so towards light or towards sound. So together, the midbrain plus the pons plus the medulla makes up the brainstem. So this very basic part of the brain that is super important for just regulating homeostasis and the way our body is functioning, basically. You can't survive without your brainstem. So right behind the brainstem, posterior to the brainstem, is this region known as the cerebellum, which means little brain. It is super dense. It has lots and lots of neurons in it, and as we learned in class, it is controlling movement, so it's helping to regulate movement. It's not actually sending signals to the muscles to tell them to contract. Instead, it's modifying the signals that are being sent. So it's helping to have you make really nice, fine motor movements that are really well controlled. Okay, so that's the cerebellum. So if we make our way a little bit further into the interior of the brain, so what we're looking at here is a cross-section through the middle of the brain, so we can see some of the interior structures. So if we go above the midbrain, we can see the thalamus here. And the thalamus is an important area of the brain for sensory integration. So many of the sensory neurons and secondary neurons from the senses will make synapses in the thalamus before heading up to the cortex. So the thalamus is starting to integrate all of the different sensory information together before it gets sent up to the cortex. And if we look right above the thalamus, there's this hole, which is actually a ventricle. So this would be filled with cerebral spinal fluid. Above the ventricle is this whiter area. So this is white matter. It has a lot of axons in it. This is known as the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum helps connect the two hemispheres of the brain. So all the axons that are traveling between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain is helping to coordinate the left and the right sides. Below the thalamus is the hypothalamus, which we've heard about before, of course. So we know that the hypothalamus is important for regulating body temperature. It's also important for release of hormones from the pituitary, and it's involved in lots of other mechanisms that help us maintain these very basic homeostatic processes. So below the hypothalamus is the pituitary, and we know that there's an anterior and a posterior pituitary, as we've talked about before. So this is actually endocrine tissue, especially the anterior pituitary is endocrine tissue, but it is located in the brain. Okay, and then our final structure is the cerebral cortex. This is what you see when you look at a brain without cutting it open. These are all the folds that you're used to seeing, so the cerebral cortex here. Okay, and the cerebral cortex is doing lots of higher order processing of sensory information. So each one of the senses has a specific place in the cerebral cortex where it sends information. It's also integrating all the sensory information together. It's helping to make movements. So there's an area called the motor cortex that is necessary for controlling your muscle movement. And actually, if you don't have a motor cortex, you're paralyzed. So this is a lot more important area than the cerebellum is. The cerebral cortex is also important for very higher order processes like learning and memory, planning ahead, making, thinking about your future, being motivated. All of this is in the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex has 4 main lobes to it, which we can see in the top left image here. So it kind of looks like a fist, and the part that would be your thumb here is known as the temporal lobe. So if you look at the slide from class that had the functional areas, the temporal lobe has the areas for auditory. So all the information from your ears, hearing information is coming into the temporal lobe, olfaction and tastes, and there's also some areas that are important for learning and memory. So that's the temporal lobe. In the back of the brain is the occipital lobe, and this area is really specialized for vision. So the primary visual cortex is in the occipital lobe and all these other supplemental areas for vision. Right in front of the occipital lobe is the parietal lobe. And we learned that the parietal lobe is where the somatosensory cortex is located. So information from touch and pain and temperature, all of that is going into the parietal lobe. And then in front of that is the frontal lobe. So the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex, is found in the frontal lobe, and then this area called the prefrontal cortex, which is important for personality and planning and all these very higher order processes that are going on in the brain. So that's it for anatomy that you need to know for MCB 32. Hope that was helpful.